Hi students, this week we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into Entity Framework Core within ASP.NET MVC Core. So as hopefully you're all aware by now, Entity Framework Core, or Entity Framework in general, is an ORM or Object Relation Mapper between databases and our C# code. So it's an easy way to make sense of all of the entities and relationships we have in our SQL Server or our relational database tables, and then bring those relationships within our code. That way we can model the rows and columns within our relational data tables as regular old C#, so we can go through and work with those objects and classes as if they came straight from the database, because they did. So this week we're going to look through a book example. So chapter 13, which is the next chapter in the book, covers a bookstore website. So it has different books with authors, etc. We don't actually go through that chapter during the semester. It is a good chapter to look through, as it's a complete website build, basically from chapter 1 through chapter 12. So then it goes through and kind of puts all of the stuff we've done all together. So it's a good chapter to go through and read to see exactly how you can go through and stub out your final project or something like that. But it's not a chapter that I go through because there's really no new information added in that. It's a culmination of the other chapters put together. So I'm going to go through and we're going to code out how they go through and build that website. There's a couple different ways to build a website, or to build a database, I'm sorry. One of those ways is code first, where you code out your C# classes, and then you tell Entity Framework to make the database based off of the classes that you create. And the second way to do it is build your database, and then from that database you tell C# to look at the database to make the classes for you. So it's all based on your preference. A lot of people like to do code first, especially when the project is just getting off the ground, but sometimes it's not an option. Maybe if you work somewhere, the database already exists, it's existed for 30 years, and they need to have a website built off of it, then you'd want to do the other direction, where you build your entities from the already existing database, which we will look at after this in my next video. So make sure you go through this PowerPoint. It goes through the chapter. You can see distinguish between code first development and database first development. We're going to go through our context classes and all of our entity classes to build our database here. So I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this. Let's go through, and here's my SQL server that's up. So let's go through and make a project. So let's go ahead and go through, let's go to my core applications. Let's go ahead and make a new folder. I'm going to call it bookstore. Okay, so there's my bookstore folder that I'm going to encapsulate my website within. Let's go ahead and open up a new VS Code project. Okay, so we see I'm within my bookstore folder, so I can go ahead, let me open a new terminal. Let's go ahead and get rid of this. I'm going to go ahead and, via the .NET CLI, if you're using Visual Studio, you can simply create a new MVC project. I'm going to do .NET new MVC to scaffold a project out for me so I don't have to do it. And it looks like it's finished. Okay, so a couple things I'll need to do is first, I'm going to move this over here. I'm actually going to steal my connection string from another one of my projects. Let me go ahead and open that up. Okay, so here's my app settings.json. So here's where I'm going to put my connection string. Let's go ahead and put a new JSON element, connection strings. I'm going to call it bookstore context. And let's go ahead and call the database bookstore. Okay, and that's all I'm going to steal from that file. The next thing, just to save time here, I'm going to steal is the startup.cs file. So let's go ahead and let me open that up. Let's go to my startup.cs. It has all the default code in here that comes with the scaffolded template here. Let me go ahead and paste in this and get rid of some stuff we're not using. Actually, let's go ahead and get rid of this, but we will be using Entity Framework Core. So everything should be the same. The only thing I'm adding is just this context here. So everything else is still the same. I added in this context, which will be called bookstore context. Context. Let's go ahead and tell it to generate that class in a new file. So I'm going to control period this, which will generate type bookstore context, generate class bookstore context in a new file, which I'll say yes, do that please. Let's go ahead and make this public. Change this namespace, because I definitely didn't want to make that the namespace to begin with. So let's go ahead and say bookstore. In my startup class, I needed to change this namespace to bookstore, since I copied and pasted from my other application. Okay, so now I have a bookstore context, right? I'll need to extend DB context, but I won't be able to extend it until I include Entity Framework Core. So I have not yet included my Entity Framework Core packages yet. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and include them via my .NET CLI here. So again, if you're using Visual Studio, you can include in these NuGet packages via the NuGet package manager. If you're using Visual Studio Code, you'll have to do it via the .NET CLI. So what we want to do is include Entity Framework Core, Entity Framework Core SQL Server, and Entity Framework Core Tools. I'm not sure if we use the tools or not, but I'm going to go ahead and include it anyway. So let's go ahead and say use the .NET CLI, add, and I want to add it to my bookstore.cs proj. So if you're in the root of your application, you can simply tab, and it will tab through the files or folders that you're currently in. So I want to add it to my main CS proj file. And I want to add the package reference for Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. And then if I don't specify a version, it should include the most recent stable version. It looks like it was able to do that. So if I go and click on my CS proj file, I should have that reference now, and I do. So let me go back. I'll need to include the SQL Server for this extension method to work. Let me go ahead and change this bookstore context. So let's go ahead and .SQL Server. And now this red line should go away. Okay, and it does. Okay, so I'm not sure if this needs that. No, so I might need that tools version. So I can include that now. Okay, no, it looks like it fixed itself. Okay, it probably wasn't a DB context because I had not yet extended that, and now it is. So my CS proj should be fine. My app settings JSON should be fine. So let's go ahead and code. I'm going to wait on coding my bookstore context until I have all of my other classes. But what I can do is generate a constructor for it. So I'm going to go ahead and generate a constructor that calls the base options. So I have, I don't know why it gave me this. So I have bookstore context, not null attribute. Sure, you can use a not null attribute. DB context options, and then I'm just going to go ahead and pass on those options to the database context base class. And I think that's all I'm going to do there for now. Okay. The next thing I will do is go to models and start building out these models that I'm going to use to show my relationships for my bookstore classes. So let's go ahead and go into my models, go ahead and create a new file, and I'm going to say author. So I'm going to have a table for my authors. I'm going to have an author.cs. I want to go ahead and say namespace will be my bookstore, is it capital S bookstore? Yeah, it is. All right, bookstore dot models, like so. The next one other thing I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and inject this into my controller while I'm thinking about it. So here's my home controller. I don't know if I'm going to put anything on the home page for the bookstore, but I'm going to go ahead and say bookstore context, ctx for context, and then let's go ahead and make the context as a class level variable up here. So I can say bookstore context. Okay, so now I am dependency injecting in my database to the home controller. So that should be all I need to do there. I can go ahead and call it maybe. No, I can't quite yet because I don't have any of the models created. All right, let's go back to the models then. Let's go ahead and say public class author. So I'm going to make a table of authors. So a couple of things you can do is you can explicitly code out your database information, or the book mentions you can do it by convention, which is what I'll do with my ID fields. So if you go ahead and say prop, which will an automatic implementation of a property, I want to say, yep, I want to do that. I want to make it an integer, and I want to say author ID. So because I made it an integer and it has the letters ID in it, it will actually automatically pick up that I'm going to have this be my primary key. And a couple of other things I'm going to go ahead and do. I'm going to have a first name for my authors and a last name. And I'll go ahead and also auto implement a property string full name, except I'm not going to have, I'm just going to have a getter that's going to return the first name as well as the last name. Let's go ahead and give the correct name there. Okay, so now I have the first name of the author, I have the last name of the author, I have their full name, and then the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give it an I. Let me go ahead and just make a prop so I can auto-generate a lot of this stuff. I collection, and I'm going to give it an I collection of book author. And that I have not yet created. But essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a table of books, I'm going to have a table of authors, and then I'm going to have a linking table, or essentially a many-to-many relationship between the two. And this will, this property here will demonstrate that many-to-many relationship between my authors and my books. So essentially, books can have many authors, and many authors can write many books. So there's that many-to-many relationship. And I'm going to display that with a class that will include the author's ID and the book's ID. So let's go ahead and, since I don't have that class yet, let me control period. And I want to generate that book author in a new file. And then since I generated it in a new file, this error should go away, and it does. So while we're thinking about the book author, let's go ahead and code out this book author class. So the book author class is pretty simple. I'm going to have a property, and I'm going to say it's an integer book ID, and another property as an integer author ID. So it's that linking table between the books and the authors to display that many-to-many relationship. Lastly, I'm going to make a property called author for the author of that book that's displayed in the ID, as well as the book that's, let me actually do prop here, book, that's the book that this relationship is displaying. And the book is not created yet, so that opens another can of worms. So let me go ahead and generate the class book in a new file. So the book author is the only thing we'll need there. I'll need to save this file so that can see it. Let's close some of this stuff. So I have my book author. I have my author. Let's go ahead and code out my class book. Well, actually, let me go back to author. I forgot some stuff on author when I went ahead and created book author. So I'm going to go ahead and add some attributes here. So if we remember the required attribute for first name, you can actually error message equals please enter a first name. So we can display error messages for if we don't include some of these things, and what we can also do is tell the database that these are required as well. So if this string first name, if I didn't have this, it would say this is nullable, but I don't want it to be nullable. I want the first name to be required. It wouldn't make sense to have an author if I couldn't see who that author was. So let me also give a string length parameter here as well. And I'm going to make these also exist for my last name. Okay. And the last thing the book has is a remote validation attribute that makes sure that the, here I'll just go ahead and put it here in the code actually. If I say remote, check author validation, and the additional fields equals first name operation. So we're not going to use these. I'm just going to put them in here because they're in the book. But if you read the chapter on validation attributes, essentially what these are, it tells it what method we want to call to validate that this last name exists in your table, or that it's required, or whatever validation you're going to do here. I'm not going to code the validation method, but if you bring down the website in the book, it'll show you what these methods do that do this remote validation to ensure this last name is validated. Okay. So let's go the book author. I think I'm finished with. Let's finish up book here. So I'm going to have the book's ID, and again I'm going to, I think my caps lock is on. Book ID. I'm going to code this table by convention, so it should auto recognize that this is my primary key. Now let's go ahead and create another property for the title of the book. Let's go ahead and code out my validation messages while I'm at it. So let's go ahead and put that the title is required and the error message equals please enter a title. And I'm also going to put a string length of 200 on it. Okay, let's go ahead and create another property. Double price, and again I'll put some more validation on the price. Let's go ahead and give it a range. So let's go ahead and say from 0 to million. and the error message equals price must be more than 0. Okay, let's another property, string genre ID, and these will be at the bottom here. These will be for the genre. This will be a foreign relationship. So I want to have the genre that's attached to this book. And let's go ahead and say prop genre. And I don't think I have a genre created yet, so let's go ahead and generate my genre because that'll be the next class that I code out here. And then the last thing I want is another iCollection of book author. So if you remember, we had an iCollection of book author for the authors, and I'm also going to have the same thing for books. That way we can have that relationship displayed here as well, since this is part of that many-to-many relationship. Okay, so the last class, we have books, we have book author, and let's go ahead and code out genre. So we have author, which will show our authors in our table. We have book, which will show our books in our table with the genres attached. We have book author, which will display that many-to-many relationship between book IDs and author IDs. And we have the genres that will be attached to the book, which should be fairly simple here. Let's go ahead and say property string genre ID. So we're not going to code the genre IDs with integers here. We're actually going to use a string, and string length of 10. Let's go ahead and add in my data annotations using statement here. And then from there, let's go ahead and add in a required attribute, where the error message equals please enter a genre ID. And there's also some remote validation attached to this, so I will just go ahead and add it in, but we're not going to do anything with it. So let's go ahead and say check genre, validation. Okay. And now that I have genre ID, let's go ahead and create the last property, which will be string the name of the genre. And then go ahead and put some attributes on this as well, such as string length of 25, and not a regular expression, but required, where the error message is please enter a genre name. And lastly, we're going to attach all of the books that are attached to this particular genre. So we're going to say iCollection of books, and I'll need to go ahead and include the iCollection using statement here for collections generic. All right, so now we have all of our plain old C# objects coded. Now we can go back to the context and add in those 4 tables that I created first of all. So I can say property of db set of authors. So I'm going to have to include the model's namespace here. Let's go ahead and create another property for a db set of book called books. Another property for a db set of book author, book authors, and lastly a property for a db set of genre called genres. So there is the 4 tables that we'll have in our database. And lastly, what we want to do is we want to use the on-model creating method that we're going to override from the DB context. So we can say protected override void on model creating. We want to say, we want to inject in the model builder. Okay, so whenever we run a migration or anything where we create this model, it's going to call this onModelCreating method to bind all of those keys to each other. So if we remember, what we have is the many-to-many relationship between book authors. So we have the book ID and the author ID. So we'll need to set up that relationship, which will be the most complex thing we do. And then after that, I'm going to add in the relationship between the genre and the book. So let's first do the book author relationship. So I'm going to go ahead and set up model.entity book author. So we want to set up the relationship for book author. Then we're going to use the Fluent API, which should kind of be able to have us type this out in English almost. Now I say almost because we're going to be using some Lambda syntax as well. So I did modelbuilder.entity of book author, and I'm going to say has key because this actually has two keys between the model, the book ID, and the author ID. So I'm going to go ahead and create a anonymous type here, which is this syntax because it's new, but we're not giving it a type. All we're doing is new and then curly braces, and essentially saying that's anonymous. It's just called an anonymous type in C#, which we don't talk about a lot because we don't use them a lot. But within this context, we are going to use it. So we have the book ID and the author ID. Okay, so that's the two keys of that. And then let's go ahead and set up that relationships. Let's say modelbuilder.entity, and again, we're going to be working with that book author. And then the book author, we can say has one. Let's go and say book author dot book. With many, so it has one book that could be attached to many authors. So then we can say book dot authors. Book authors. Okay. And has foreign key of book ID. All right, and let's set up the relationship the other direction then. So again, we need to say book author, and that has one. Let's see, we have ba.author with many. Again, what am I missing here? ba.author, book author, model entity has one ba author with many. What am I missing here? So we have a book with many book authors. So we should be able to have authors with many book authors. Unless I messed something up on my book author table. Book author, so I have book ID, author ID. So that looks right. I have an author ID first name, last name, full name. Oh, I didn't create this property. Book authors. Whoops. Okay. So now I should be able to have book authors in here, and I do. Has foreign key. Okay, now we're back on track. GA author ID. Okay, now let's go ahead and do the genre to book. So let's go ahead and entity book. So it has one genre attached to it. So book genre with many books. And then I'm going to go ahead and create a constraint on delete, which I will restrict. So what I want to happen is whenever I delete a genre, I want it to throw an exception if there's currently books attached to that genre. So that's called orphaning records. So you don't want to leave records that don't have anything attached to it. So let's say there's a genre of drama, and we delete drama, and there's 6 books that have drama still attached to it, that now whenever you try to access it, it's going to throw an exception. So I want to throw an exception when I try to delete it. That way it doesn't delete that record. Or it will at least tell me, hey, I can't cascade delete this record because there's currently books attached to it. Are you sure you'd like to do it, or something like that? And I want to make sure that that happens. That way I don't accidentally delete a genre that currently has things attached to it. So the last thing I want to do is seed some data. So I'm going to call model builder dot apply configuration, and I'm going to say new seed genres. And there's currently not this class created, so I'm going to have to do that. And what you can actually do this for every single table that you have. So author, book, genre, etc. I'm going to go ahead and put this in a new file, change the namespace, because I'm actually going to put this in my models folder. So you notice public class seed genres. I'm going to have this taken a type of genre. And since this is an interface, I'm going to go ahead and implement the interface. And you can see that it automatically gives me this configure method. And what I want to do is just simply configure some startup data for it. So I'm going to change this, instead of builder, I'm going to say entity. And then we can say entity.hasData. I'm going to go ahead and close this. New genre. Okay. So what genre do I want? The genre ID equals, let's say, mystery, and the name of the genre will then equal mystery. Okay, so now that I have all of this coded out, what I can do is I want to create a migrations folder, much like the migrations folder that comes with your projects that you run locally to create this database. So I could have all of my other tables as well to see data if I didn't want to do this every single time. So where is my context? So if I wanted this video to go another 10 minutes, I would do this, but I don't. So I want to also see data for books, see data for authors, and then seed data for book authors. So if you want to go through and do this yourself, you can follow the rest of the book to see the rest of the data, but I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next step, which will be to actually create this database now that we have all of these entities defined. So what we're going to do is turn to the CLI, the .NET CLI, and we're going to go ahead and say .NET EF for Entity Framework, and I want to say -- help. So whenever I'm not 100% sure I know what to do, I do know I want to work with Entity Framework, and I know I want to add migrations. So what I can do is I can see that I have commands, migrations. So I can say, okay, I bet I want to do something with migrations. So I can do .NET EF migrations, and then maybe do -- help. So that way it'll give me some help on what I can do with migrations. And I see I have commands adds a new migration. Okay, and what that's going to do is add in a folder with the migration of however my project is currently set up. So let's go ahead and .NET EF for Entity Framework, migrations, add, and then I'll give this a name of initial, which is what the book usually uses. So .NET EF migrations add initial. Go ahead and run that. It'll try to build your code, make sure everything is compiling. So I think I need that Entity Framework Tools version that I never ended up installing. Sure enough, I did not. So before I do this, let's go ahead and add in .tools. Go to my CS proj folder, and it's there. And now let's go ahead and try to add that migration again. And there it went. So I was just missing that tools NuGet package. So now I have this migrations folder with the initial migration in it. So now I can run, I can go to .NET again, EF help, and we can see that I can run my database here. So now I can do .NET EF database help. And you can see that I can do a database update command. So let's go ahead and say .NET EF database update. So it should look at that migrations folder, see the initial migration, and run that migration. I'm not sure why it's complaining about the tools version being out of date, because I literally just installed it. Okay, so now that has ran. Looks like it finished. Let's go ahead and open up SQL Server. I do have it open already. Let's go to databases. Let's refresh the list because I had it open previously. And we see I have my bookstore database here. So if I open it, go to tables, I have my authors table, my book authors, my books, my genres, and if I open up my genre, I should have my mystery genre already in here. So if I seeded more data, it would already be in here. I can open up my books table. I won't have any books, but if I seeded books, I would have books in here. You can see I have book ID, the title, the price, the genre. Let's also go in here and say columns. You can see that title is not null because I put in a required attribute in C#. The price is not null. Let's go ahead and look at authors as well. And I bet if I look at the first name and last name, it's also not null because I put in those required attributes in C#. Okay, so now that we've looked at creating this database here using Entity Framework code first migrations, let's go and look at how we can use this already existing database to generate the code for us rather than the other direction. And we'll do that in the next video. So I hope this video was a pretty good explanation of how to use Entity Framework Core doing the code first migrations to create your tables. And I'll go ahead and see you in the next video. Thanks.